Hello, do people give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Thank you. Great. Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And we're in the midst of the virtual reading group's reading of Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. We have spent 2 weeks on it so far, read the House of Justice and the Accused and the Expert on the Jewish Question. So largely focused so far on the reading in the reading on Arendt's beginnings account of Eichmann and who he was and what he began to do and did during the war. Today we're going to read three of the middle sections of the book. So remember, this is a report, as she calls it, a report of her time, both at the trial, which was only about a week, and then reading through the transcripts of the trial, of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. And what she says in these three chapters, which are on, she in a sense breaks the war up, and maybe you could even say breaks the Holocaust up into three stages. The first stage being what she calls expulsion, and it runs approximately from 1933 until 1934, I guess, when Eichmann actually joined the party, until 1939 in September. And she says in this period it was largely about forced emigration of the Jews. There was an attempt to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews, pure of Jews. And Eichmann's job was, as he eventually became the head of a particular German agency, the Reichssicherheitsamt, section 4B, 4B4. His job was to help to force and make possible the Jews leaving Germany. And it was, as he and she describe it, not always an easy job, because there were, on the one hand, lots of barriers that the German state put up to Jews leaving, even though they wanted them out. They wanted them out without their money, for the most part. And then there were not many places Jews could go. And so it is in this period that she says the major thrust of his work was to get the Jews out of Germany. The second stage goes from about 1939 to about 1940-41, and this is where the Jews are being concentrated. There's largely nowhere for them to go. There's few countries that will take them, and so emigration begins to cease, and they begin to look for places to put the Jews and move them to places they could be out of the way and be out of Germany. And then the third chapter is about the beginnings around 1940-41 of what comes to be known as the final solution, at which point Jews are being sent to either killed in the fields through the Einsatzgruppen, where they are just shot, or being sent to extermination camps and gassed, if not other things. So, on the one hand, you have a history of this period to some degree here that makes distinctions that are often elided, I think, in our approach to thinking about this period and the people in it, and you have her attempt, and I think we have to ask ourselves a number of questions about this, but What she specifically says is that she's going to give a fuller defense of Eichmann than he and his attorney gave at the trial. So she starts off in this text on page 56, chapter 4, the first solution, expulsion. And she says, had this been an ordinary trial with the normal tug of war between prosecution and defense to bring out the facts and do justice to both sides, it would be possible to switch now to the version of the defense and find out whether there was not more to Eichmann's grotesque account of his activities in Vienna than meets the eye, and whether his distortions of reality could not really be ascribed to more than the mendacity of an individual. We go to the defense. What is the defense? What is Eichmann's defense of what he did? And what she says is, on the one hand, we knew all the facts. Everyone knew that he was guilty of, and beyond a reasonable doubt, guilty for having participated in the crimes of the Nazi regime. But there were additional facts that the prosecution wanted to establish, namely that he was an eager participant, that he intended to kill Jews, and that he did, in fact, kill Jews. And what she says is the defense never really opposed that, partly because the defense lawyer, Dr. Servatius, largely ignored it. He didn't make these distinctions. And so she is here, on the one hand, doing some history. On the other hand, trying to say that there are distinctions, and this is something that Arendt does throughout her life and her work. She wants us to make distinctions, and she wants to make distinctions between the 6 years from 1933 to 1939, the 2 years from 39 to 41, and then the years after 41 during the final solution. So one thing that I think we have to talk about today is are these distinctions that she wants to make meaningful, right? Is it meaningful that we make a distinction between a time in which the policy is expulsion to a time in which the policy is concentration to a time in which the policy is killing? And then the second question is, does that matter for our understanding of Eichmann, right? Does it matter to us that when Eichmann was most enthusiastic about what he did, his job was largely expulsion. His job was largely getting Jews out of Germany. Now, we can be critical of someone who thinks Jews have to get out of Germany, but Eichmann himself says he was very enthusiastic about this. As he said in the Sassen interviews in Argentina, and Arendt quotes on page 57, he did not greet his assignment with the apathy of an ox being led to his stall. Eichmann actually was quite excited about his job, and that's one of the reasons that he and Arendt reject this argument that is so often made that Eichmann was simply a bureaucrat, a cog in the wheel. I think this is an argument that many of the critics of this book have I think, mistakenly made, which is that they say that Arendt excused Eichmann because he was simply a cog. That is as far from the case as possible. Arendt does not see Eichmann as a cog. She saw him as someone who actively participated and innovated and engaged in his job. And her proof for that is actually Eichmann himself, who says that. He took great pride in the fact that he saw himself as someone who was not just a cog, was not just a bureaucrat. Another controversial aspect of these pages is that what she says is that in many ways what Eichmann was doing was what many Jews were doing at this period, especially the Zionists, which was helping to get the Jews out of Germany. The Zionists saw Hitler's election and rise to power, Arendt says, as the decisive defeat of assimilation. Hence, the Zionists could for a time, and this is important, this is on page 59 at the bottom, hence the Zionists could for a time at least engage in a certain amount of non-criminal cooperation with the Nazi authorities. The Zionists too believed that dissimilation combined with immigration to Palestine of Jewish youngsters, and they hoped Jewish capitalists, could be a mutually fair solution. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this, and let me say one thing, that Arendt comes to believe that after a certain period, certainly after 1939, Jewish cooperation with the Nazis she sees in a much different light, much more criminal and much more problematic. But at this time, she's saying there were a lot of Zionists and others who actually thought you could work with the Germans. Doesn't mean you agreed with them, doesn't mean you liked them, but you could work with them. And she talks for a number of pages about all the different emissaries who came from Palestine, as well as some German Zionists who Eichmann helped, worked with, who testified at the trial that he was polite, that he treated them well, not the shouting type. This is all on page 60 and 61, that he set up farms and facilities for Jews to train themselves on how to get to Palestine. One said that he expelled a group of nuns from a convent to provide a training farm for young Jews. So, and her claim is, well, his claim is that she repeats and that she thinks is not inaccurate, is that he saved many thousands of Jews at a time in which the UK and the US and other countries would not take Jews. He worked with Jews in Palestine to help get Jews out of Germany in this period. And that he felt elated, as she says on page 62 about this. In 1937, he was sent to, I think it's 1937, he was sent to Vienna, and he was promoted 4 times in a very short period of time. And in its Vienna, where he was recognized as a Jewish expert, he set up the model authority that became the model for all other German efforts to force Jews to emigrate. Now, again, none of this is to say that Arendt thinks Eichmann is a good person, or that he wasn't anti-Semitic, or that he wasn't participating in a crime or anything like that. None of that is true. She did. But what she's saying is, at this period, a lot of what he did is what a lot of other people did. Now, he did, obviously, to say he did it and Jews did it is not the same thing. But she says that, I think what she's trying to say is that at this period, what he did, we can maybe think of as wrong. I don't know. We can talk about it. But it's certainly not genocide, and it's something else. So maybe I'll stop there just and give you a chance to react to her argument of this first chapter of the first 6 years of Eichmann's experience in the world, in the war, and hear what you guys think. Because, when people criticize Arendt for this book, the main things they criticize her for are the banality of evil, which we haven't even talked about yet so far in the book. We're already in the page 70 or so. And the Judenräte, her claims that Jews collaborated. But that doesn't even come into account until 1941. So she doesn't usually get criticized for what she writes in this chapter, and yet I think it's quite controversial. And it's provocative, and I'd like to hear what you guys think about it before we move on. So if anyone wants to jump in there, please do. maybe
Well,
not.
not
Go
really
ahead.
not having been a historian for several decades now. I haven't kept up on the literature and on the history. So all I'm going on is what I'm reading in the text. And you raised the question of whether or not it was important to distinguish between the phases, the three phases. And I think it's very important because people evolve, institutions evolve, policies evolve. And when you throw in your cards with somebody else or with some policy, there comes a point when maybe you know and maybe you don't know that things have changed. And of course, to some extent, I see that in Washington, D.C. right now. And so I can't help but read this in relationship to those who have thrown in their cards with Trump. Maybe the evangelicals, for example, they like his position on abortion. I can understand that. But then they like his position on abortion, and so then they start apologizing for the way he tears those families at the border apart. So again, I think distinguishing, at the time, it's probably not quite as easy to see that, but in historical perspective, which is what historians do, it is legitimate to see those changes, that evolution.
Thanks, Bob.
Roger,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the period of expulsion, that's the first period that she identifies, and there are certain things that need to be said about that. The first, of course, is that concentration camps had already been created, that people were being concentrated, if I can use that term, from the very beginning of the Hitler regime. The communists and some Jews, anti-Nazi activists, were being rounded up and put into camps. And during that period that we're talking about, some people came back from Dachau and some did not. So there is this idea that the extermination doesn't begin until later, although as a policy that may be true. As a fact, it is not true. Because
Jack, can I just ask a quick question from what you're saying?
Sure.
And sometimes we use these words, and we've gotten a lot of, when we had these camps down at the Mexican border about a year ago, there was a lot of question about whether to call them concentration camps, and there was debates about what a concentration camp is. And, Arendt in certain places makes a distinction between three different kinds of camps: extermination camps, work camps, and concentration camps. So you're right, there were camps at this point. Not yet, I don't think, Dachau, because it was in Poland, and Auschwitz. Or no, Dachau's in Germany?
Dachau's in Germany.
Dachau's in Germany. I don't know when Dachau started.
Dachau was one of the earliest.
Pretty early.
34.
But at this point, these are not. They're certainly not extermination camps, and so I just want to make sure that's what you're saying, or are you saying something different?
Well, no. What I'm trying to say is that it was not a policy. The concentration camps did not have a policy of exterminating the people within them, but some people died anyway. Many people died because of the way they were being treated in these concentration camps. The cruelty that we associate with life in the camps began very much earlier, and it was very much present in Germany. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that the expulsion of the Jews had essentially two parts, which is that there were a significant number of Jews in Germany who the Germans did not consider to be German. They were people who had emigrated into Germany either just before or just after World War I, and it represented a significant, not the overwhelming fraction of the population, but a significant fraction of the Jewish population. And those people had a status that at that time was had a worldwide acceptance, namely a stateless status. They had citizenship perhaps in the countries that they came from, mostly Poland, of course, but they had no German citizenship. And so the expulsion of those people is different than the decision to expel German citizens. And the key factor for me in thinking about the period of expulsion is that it was a period of denial of citizenship to people who had earned citizenship, either by long-standing agreement going back into the early part of the 19th century, or through the various means by which people became citizens of Germany at the time. So I make that distinction. There really is a distinction. The idea of expelling Jews who aren't Germans, that's one thing that Germans can and should accept, perhaps. But the idea of expelling Jews who are Germans is a whole other matter. And this takes place during that first period. So what I'm trying to say here is that the idea of making these distinctions is useful in some ways, but it should not be taken as very distinct distinctions, that there are many, many things going on all at the same time that are leading to the genocide. The abrogation of citizenship, in my opinion, the abrogation of citizenship and the creation of concentration camps, those are the early steps, so that by the time you come to Wannsee, you already have a lot of experience.
Yeah, I mean, just so we're all clear on facts, and I'm happy to have people, help me with the facts. I mean, the Nuremberg laws were, I think, in 1935.
That's correct.
Which prevented Jews from serving in civil service and other positions, but did not strip them of their citizenship, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know actually when that happened, the stripping of the citizenship. It probably was after 38, but I'm not positive. Do you know that, Jack?
I don't know the answer to that question because
1938.
Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody else answer.
Somebody's trying to talk, but I can't hear them.
So that's when.
Oh.
My answer, I'm sorry, as long as I'm on, let me answer that. September 1935 was when Hitler essentially said Jews have no rights. No rights at all. Now, they may retain citizenship, I don't know about that, but they had no rights. That was the stripping of the rights, 1935.
Sam, did you want to add something? Because we're having trouble hearing you.
Plugged into the router, so I'm not sure. Is that better? I can turn off the camera. I don't think I can make it better. But I was just going to say 1938 is the year when Austrian Jews were, I believe, en masse, and the Anschluss rounded up and expelled to Dachau and so on. But I think one of the things that, the extermination camps were originally established, and Art makes this point, as detention initially to hold what she calls the aliens and undesirables. So years later, that they were repurposed, and she's trying to trace the evolution of the camps in that sense. I think in part, and these just what I was going to add.
Yeah, Sam, I don't know if you might have to turn your camera off because at least I'm having trouble hearing a lot of it. I'm not sure if other people are, but I think I got most of it. One other thing just to think about, Jack, in response to your question is, while a lot of what you're saying about this is right, Eichmann himself, and that's what Arendt is really talking about here, Eichmann himself was not involved with the camps at this point, right? That has to be remembered.
He was actually working to get people to Palestine. He went to Palestine to set things up so that people could come to Palestine. And he
went for like a day and then was kicked out. But yes, he was largely at this point working to get Jews out of Germany. He didn't. I mean, we at this point, I guess we all wish he would have succeeded more. But he got some out, and he did it through, working with Jews, working with people in Palestine, working with Germans, and so, this is an attempt of Arendt's to say, well, I don't know. I mean, I think I have to tell you, it's not entirely clear to me the argument she's making in these chapters. I think you can say to some degree that she's trying to make an argument, that his guilt at different points was different, which is not going to change the fact that he's still guilty. So it's not, what is she actually trying to say? But I think she wants to show the stages of his moral complicity. And Bob, I think, made the important point. I mean, I think it's very hard to read these chapters and not think about what's going on today. You start by doing things that you can justify, right? Getting Jews out of Germany. I mean, you're still taking away their rights, as Jack said, and you're taking away their livelihood and taking away their money. But he can justify it and say, well, there's Jews who want to get out of Germany too, and so I'm doing it. And then you say, oh, we're going to concentrate them in certain areas, in the general government area of Poland and other things. And then you come to the final solution, and you have to kill them. And the key pages here and the key things we should really spend our time discussing are from pages 90 through basically 95 or 96. And the question Arendt here raises is the question of Eichmann's conscience. She says at the bottom of 90 to 91, one last question, the most disturbing of all, was asked by the judges, and especially by the presiding judge, over and over again. Had the killing of Jews gone against his conscience? But this was a moral question, and the answer may not have been legally relevant. But it's the question she gets most interested in. And between the next 5 pages, what she basically argues is that he had a conscience. He had an innate repugnance to crime. And she takes us through his first encounters with seeing Jews gassed and seeing Jews shot. And she talks about how he threw up and pissed his pants, and he was appalled by it, and even told one of his superiors that they were going to create sadists of our young people. And that eventually, though, he came to see that it was his moral and legal duty to follow the orders and carry out the final solution. And Arendt has this truly chilling and incredible line where she says on page 95 at the end of the first paragraph, he had a conscience, and his conscience functioned in the expected way for about 4 weeks, whereupon it began to function the other way around. And this, to me, is one of the chilling and true insights of the book. And I think it's the reason that she does this, that she separates these chapters into 3 stages. She wants to show how each stage leads upon to the next, and how when you finally get to the 3rd stage, how easy it is to turn your conscience around. And that's the lesson that I think she takes from these chapters. And I think it's the lesson that I've always thought, the fact that we learn this lesson, if we do, is what might protect us from it happening again on a mass scale. And yet I think it's the question we all have to be asking ourselves right now. Right now, most people in the government are not doing things that are illegal. Most people are not doing things you may think they're immoral, they're this or that, but they can be argued, each one on its own. But the question is, at what point do the consciences get turned around? And that's a big part of why I think she separates these three stages to show how that happens.
It's not just conscience, right? Am I breaking up?
No, I hear you, but someone's got another mic on, so remember, turn your mics off if you're not talking.
It's not just the conscience. It's me, I think, unfortunately.
Peter, are you trying to talk?
Yeah, I'm talking via phone, and
Okay,
it seems to be echoing.
Go ahead.
Are you hearing it echo?
A little bit, but we can hear you.
All right. I mean, I guess it's the intriguing thing for me is the conscience issue, which is to say that if I have a conscience about the death of people in Yemen, there's other people who don't care. It seems to make no difference in outcome for the people in Yemen. And so I'm not sure why the conscience issue is that big. I also think, going back to the previous point about evolution, that our consciences kind of evolve out of a practical necessity to protect ourselves from the horrors of what we're allowing. And so we find rationales and ways of detaching ourselves from the actions that help us live with ourselves. I'll stop there.
Well, if I think she's talking not about just having the conscience of things happening in Yemen or things happening in Germany, but a conscience about what he's doing. The question is, he's carrying out these orders. And she says that for 4 weeks, he felt guilty about carrying out these orders. He still did it, but he felt guilty about it. And then after 4 weeks, he said, no, I'm just doing my job and I'm following orders, and that's my job, is to follow the orders and follow the law.
All right, but how did the change in his self-sense make a difference? He was feeling guilty and did these things, and then he stopped feeling guilty and did these things. It seems like a difference of no account. And I think that's the guilty thing is a way of us assuaging that we're not bad people like the ones doing these things. But if we're not acting upon that guilt, it don't change our behavior, then it's a difference with no difference.
I think that's a good point and a fair point. I guess my answer, or my intuitive answer, would be that to if you're feeling guilt and someone were to stand up and say this is wrong, there may be still a chance to reach you as a moral being. Whereas once you've made that turn away, I think it's much harder to reach you as a moral being. That's an intuition of mine. I could be wrong. Obviously, I think she thinks it's important. I think she thinks it's important because if you're still feeling conscience, there's a way that you might be able to stop. But maybe that's a difference.
Can I jump in one last time?
I think if you're feeling guilty, if you're feeling wrong, I think there's a chance to reach you as a moral being and potentially help you to stop doing what you're doing.
I guess I wanted to say that yes, I think you can be less reachable, but I think there is this notion of moral luck, that some people are lucky in a bizarre way to be Jewish or of African descent during the time of slavery, that they won't commit moral wrongs the way the people in power who benefit from these things do. They're surrounded by a milieu that says the things they're doing is right, so they continue on in such a way. But I do wonder, again, what the value is. The guilt can come back and can go forward and back. It's still about actions, and the actions are supported by everything around you. And I think actually, to your point, the measure some philosophers have said is that's all true and possibly a pass unless there is a considerable or some evidence of counterthought within your society. That doesn't take you off the hook. So you had people like Boaz during the slavery period, who was known and his voice was heard. It was a minority voice, but it certainly was a counter voice. I'm just wondering how much counter voice there was other than in the shadows in Eichmann's world.
Can I make a quick comment to
Please.
Stuff? Yeah, I mean, the way I see it is that we're trying to understand the process of how Eichmann got to the point of doing what he did and how other people do. So, what Peter, you're saying, it's almost as if like you're saying, we need to hold him responsible, et cetera, and it's like a matter of judging him, which is great and fine, but on the other hand, it is important to sort of understand what's going on in his mind, whether he felt guilt or didn't feel guilt, just to understand the internal processes that him and anybody else is going to be going through to get to the point of being able to do these kind of deeds. So I think it's just one of the internal processes that are really important to understand. That's all I wanted to say for now.
Great. Other comments or thoughts on this?
Yeah, Roger, can you
Yeah.
hear me? This is Margaret.
You hear me now? I just want to add something to what this conversation, which I think is really important and central to these changes. The way in which that Arne is talking about the manipulation of language and Nazi speak,
Thank you.
and the way in which the of language is what in part enables people to turn away from their more humble manner, which is something that we've talked about before in this group. And she gives a few examples of that, even used in print or hardly spoken to mask other things. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Sam, you're really breaking in and out,
Or-
and I don't know why, but I know since I'm going to have to leave it a little bit, it'd be helpful if there's a place you can go with the internet that works. I'm not sure. But I heard most of what you said. And I know Margaret wanted to say
Roger?
something as well, yes.
Yeah, Roger, I'm just going to pick on what I think Sam was saying, which what I was going to bring up, which what really hit me like a ton of bricks is pretty much in a lot of this reading was what, she calls the langles, and the way in which meaning can be taken out of actions by the change and destruction of language. And I think that is something that's a rule, very relevant to our own times. It's certainly something that writers period picked up on. And it's, I think it's also, just to go back a couple points in the discussion, she makes it very clear, it seems to me, that Eichmann in the first about this stage or first chapter here was not acting out of the goodness of his heart. He was acting out of personal ambition. He was enthusiastic because things were going, and, it wasn't, I'm doing a good deed and maybe I'll, save humanity. It was what's in it for me. But that aside, I think the main point I wanted to bring up, welfare, and I think it's so critical here is what gets done with language. And if someone is not in the process, is not language to what Arendt would call thinking, then it is easy to take in sort of denuded words, if you will, and change one's actions accordingly.
Yeah.
Or easier to say.
That's very much, to me, the lessons of these chapters is how easy it is to, through language and through seeing little opposition and through maybe being habituated into it, to be denuded, not only in your language, but in your conscience and your integrity.
I'd like to add, Roger, that one aspect of that is the legalization of activity, the progression of the changes in the laws, so that these actions are not illegal, so that you can at least tell yourself that what you're doing is within the boundary of legality. and that I think that's an important component because right now I hear a lot of chatter about the rule of law, and there are a lot of people who are upset about the ways in which the rule of law is being challenged in this country. And I'm thinking, okay, well, all they need to do is change the laws. That's not a problem. So it's keeping. It turns out that keeping people out of the country is legal because there's a law. There's a kind of a law, and then it's upheld by the Supreme Court, and then that becomes okay. It becomes okay to do because it's within the bounds of quote legality. I think that's a really important aspect of what went on during that period of expulsion, because it was during that time that they learned how to use the laws to get compliance.
Roger, can I say something? It's Mark.
Please, Mark.
Yes, that it seems to me that that use of language is really prevalent here today. It's when we have these military campaigns, there's the military assigns a name to them that is sort of out of a Western, or when we tortured people, we called it some kind of enhanced interrogation. I mean, it happens all the time. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I mean, Arendt talks about this to some degree as phrases that deflect conscience. I mean, this is on page 105, where, I mean, these are slightly different, but they coin slogans like the famous watchword, "My honor is my loyalty." And, you can call these cliches, as she often does, but it's important to think them through. I mean, my honor is my loyalty. Where does your honor stand in your loyalty? And, we're seeing now loyalty being raised up to the highest level of what it means to serve in the United States government. Loyalty above something else, dignity, or responsibility to the law, for example. And so this kind of personal loyalty to the party. You can call it empty talk or winged words, she says, but they had a difference, and these they deflect conscience in important ways that are important for us to keep in mind. I'd like us to look at. Say, yeah. Who said something?
It's Ken. Quick question.
Hi, Ken.
Roger. Hi. Yeah. So during the Nazi era, it was Hitler and them that were sort of, I guess, that were like pushing this changing of language and skirting the law. I mean, just sort of interested in your thoughts a little bit. Like, where is the push coming? Where is the pressure? Who's driving this? A lot of us think, is Trump driving this consciously in this country now? Is it just a property of postmodernism, that tendencies that happen? I mean, are there guilty parties? Where's it coming from? What's driving this? That's my simple question.
A simple question, yes. I mean, I think that there's not going to be one answer to it. But I think that people, we've talked a lot about in this reading group, and it's something Samantha and I are both have talked a lot about, that for Arendt, the ground for totalitarianism, the ground for the kind of mass movements that Nazism and Bolshevism embodied, was what she called a kind of mass loneliness, a mass sense of not being alone, but a mass sense of being without purpose, without meaning, abandoned in the world. So for Arendt, a lot of this is very much caught up with the end of metaphysics, the loss of religion as a meaningful part of people's lives that gives them a sense of purpose, the loss of firm traditions or solid traditions that gave people a sense of living as part of a world that had a past and will continue into the future. And in such a world, she says, there's a deep human need to feel like they matter, to feel meaningful. And when people feel like the people in power don't listen to them, don't trust them, ignore them, overlook them, have contempt for them, that is a devastating feeling. And so the one answer is to sort of withdraw. But I think what the opportunity emerges for leaders to emerge who give people a sense that their lives matter, that the way they see the world is right, and that it's not just their own subjective view, but it's actually part of an important movement that's going to have power and influence and meaning in the world. I think we see this on many sides right now. I think many liberals and many people, in disenfranchised groups on the left feel as if they are lost and abandoned and want to feel empowered. And I think many people on the Trump right and the Tea Party right have a similar feeling. And I think there's other groups as well. And when you feel that way, there's a deep need to bond yourself with a kind of movement that gives your life purpose. And it's in such a movement that you're willing to embrace that movement and the truth it represents, even if the truth is often things that are factually lies and you're aware of it. Samantha and I were on a panel yesterday in New York, and someone asked, this very important question, which is so many of the people don't believe what Trump says, and yet they say that they trust him more than anyone else. How is that? And I think the answer is that they trust him as someone who articulates their basic gut feelings and makes their view of the world meaningful, even if they realize that he lies about particulars. And it's that need to have someone you trust in that way that I think is in some, not the only thing I'm saying at all, but is one important root of what we're experiencing.
Can I say something?
Yes, Daphne?
I think that it's interesting to note that the belief or the people that are represented as Trump supporters to a large extent come from a time when there is an economic factor to this, and that the promises that were made by the benefits of a consumer society and enormous wealth clearly have disappointed. And so therefore, if you can't get what you think you deserve at this point in time in American society, you will believe the easiest formulation of what is a very simplistic attitude to life. And we're seeing it with the great rise suddenly of Bloomberg, who appeared out of nowhere and can buy himself. And people are succumbing or buying into that, as they were to a large extent into Trump. And in the rise of Hitler, it was during the worst time of the Weimar Republic, where people needed some sort of economic promise that this will bring them together to a greater place. I also think that Eichmann's evolution is traced in these chapters by Hannah Arendt, because he didn't necessarily start out as a person without a conscience, as she describes, but much like someone who has succumbed to the ideology that was pervasive at his time, he started to believe in it. And if he starts to believe in it, she has to trace that progress. And once you believe in it, you think that what you're doing, even if it's terrible, even if it's horrible, it's like going into becoming a doctor and a surgeon, not particularly liking to see all that misery, but getting used to it and thinking that you're going to be doing good. It's distorted, of course, in his mind, but he does evolve very much into believing that what he is doing is a good thing. And that's where ideology destroyed him.
One has to be careful about seeing this in monolithic terms. Amongst the Nazis, there were different strains. You had somebody like Albert Speer, who was in it for the excitement and to see what would happen and maybe have some architectural input. You had somebody like Streicher, who was something of a mad dog. You've got Eichmann, who starts off as a careerist. You have Himmler, who's interested in the purity of the race. And at some point, Hitler makes the decision. So again, it gets to be more complicated maybe than a characterization of Nazi supporters would lead us to believe.
I think that's a really good point, and it's one that's very hard to articulate in public conversation, right? I've encountered this just as an anecdote on the side when I try and talk about someone like Martin Heidegger, right? Martin Heidegger was a philosopher, teacher of Arendt's, a lover of Arendt's, joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and became rector of Freiburg University for the Nazis, and then was forced out or resigned in 1934. And there's no doubt he was a Nazi. He never left the party. He, and one should not in any way condone his behavior and certain things that he did, including allowing certain books to be burned and having his friend and mentor Edmund Husserl fired. And yet, he had his reasons. He did his things. And yet he's labeled as a Nazi, and Nazi now is read through 1943, 1944. And when you try and even have this conversation where you try and say, well, these are different things, it becomes maybe an impossible task to do. And I think that's one of the challenges of reading Arendt's text here, which we have to remember was written in 1963. And this is very much at the beginning of the Holocaust literature. When Arendt writes this, one of the issues is that not much had been written on the Holocaust at this point. Most of the survivors were not talking about it at this point. And so she's writing about it with a kind of aloofness, maybe, objectivity, irony, nuance. And that's a nuance that's often lost in this sort of next 50 years. And that's one of the difficulties of trying to read her text 50 years later is do we sort of welcome the nuance, or do we want to sort of push it away? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer.
I have a question, Roger. Do you know did Hannah Arendt read it at Primo Levi? Because Primo Levi wrote his book about Auschwitz in the late 40s, and I think it was published in the early 50s. And I'm just curious if she read him.
Sam might have a better answer to that than I do. Samantha, do you, Sam, do you know if you read Levy? You read Levy?
I know that. Oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I know that she had obviously read the Hilberg. I'd have to look. I think Mark Lilla writes about Arendt and Levy. That's what's coming to mind. But I would have to go back and check the library, honestly, because she doesn't cite him to my memory anywhere. But it's certainly possible that she was reading him. But I think in his book he talks about it. So not a very satisfying answer.
I have to run to go to another talk and meeting. I'm gonna let Sam take over. Thank you all, and Sam, enjoy the rest of the conversation. I'll see you guys all in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Roger. We'll see you in 3.
Thank you.
Sam, this is Scott McLean. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Scott. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm trying to formulate this because it can kind of get convoluted, but I'd like to get everybody's thoughts on this because I'm trying to relate it to things that I've experienced in my field when I was in the field that I'm in. It's typically not very bureaucratic, but I did work for one organization that was very bureaucratic. And so what I kind of want to say is, like, it seems to me that Arendt looks at Eichmann as kind of a non-thinking type. So you have a non-thinking type that is ambitious. So a lot of people who are ambitious are thinking types. But if you have somebody who's a non-thinking type, who's ambitious, a bureaucratic job that focuses on protocol over procedure. And that's a real big difference, because protocol, or whether you're a physical therapist, a doctor, or whatever, there's a danger with protocol over procedure. So, for example, if you go into a physical therapist, like if you, let's say right now, I'm in the fitness, physical, and physical fitness area and physical therapy. So today, if you go to a physical therapist because you strained your shoulder, you go in there, they do an evaluation that is a 1 through 10 procedure. Then they put you on a protocol, and the protocol is dictated by the insurance companies, and it doesn't matter if that physical therapist thinks there might be a thing that I can do that I think would be better. They have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, protocol driven, 10 visits, you're out, bye. And that's why they come to me, a personal trainer, because I do whatever I want to do, because I use procedure, so I can make decisions based on based on my own flow chart, and I can make a more qualitative, a more subjective decision. Whereas when you're stuck with protocol, you're stuck with protocol. Now, for most people, that doesn't make them a bad person, but kind of the analogy I want to make here, and I know I may be going off the deep end here, but just bear with me here. The vast majority of pit bull dogs are great dogs. You hear it all the time. The vast majority of pit bull dogs are wonderful dogs, wonderful family pets. They love their kids, they love their family, and all of that. And that's true. But here's what's also true. Almost all human fatalities from a dog are from pit bulls and Rottweilers. So what I'm saying is you have this bureaucratic system that's protocol driven. So there's no flexibility. There's no room for, now maybe at the higher ups. I'm talking about mid-level. There's no higher ups. What I'm saying here is the vast majority of people who would go into a bureaucratic protocol job are going to do just fine with it. They're going to say, they're going to punch out after their 8 hours, and they're going to go home, and they're going to make dinner, and they're going to watch TV, and they're going to dread going to work on Monday. But for the small group that are non-thinking, ambitious, all they have to do is go to work and do the protocol, and they know if they do that protocol, if they do that protocol every day for 3 years, they're going to move up to the next level.
Yeah.
And then they're going to be tired, So, I don't know what any people think about that, but that's kind of the thought I put together.
Yeah, I think one of the other people want to jump in, they can. I think one of the things that Arendt's drawing our attention to in the third chapter specifically, where she starts talking about language and the final solution, is this, and what I was trying to bring up earlier when I wasn't sure you could hear me, was the manipulation and the bureaucratization of language, which, I hear in the way that you're thinking about protocols. And for Arendt, this is a really important point. And this is what shortly after she finishes Eichmann, she writes, her essay on thinking and moral considerations, where she picks up the same question and focuses on it specifically. But what she's drawing out here is that the manipulation of language, the transformation of language into something that is bureaucratic and inhuman, right, is part of what allows people to act as good citizens, right, to act according to their conscience, their legal conscience. And that clouds out or comes before their moral consciousness as human beings, right? The easy, I think, example of this, which we hear often, is the way in which the military uses certain language to objectify targets, to dehumanize them, right? We're all familiar with this, kind of language. But Arendt is thinking about the evolution of language over time as well, which allows for the increase of inhuman treatment, right? This negation of the human, which is what she talks about at the end of Origins as well. And what we talked about, I think in our last meeting, Eichmann's a joiner. This is part of what Arendt's saying. He's a joiner, and it's not that he doesn't think. She says he does think, but it's that he lacks this kind of expansive, self-reflective consciousness, and that he has fully adopted this bureaucratic language and speak that prevents him from thinking and acting otherwise.
Sam, if I can throw something at that with you guys here.
Jason? Hi.
Yes, it's Jason. Hi.
Hi.
There's a phrase that we're all familiar with that we have been indoctrinated to that kind of sums this up in my mind, which is once upon a time. And once upon a time is a code that people use to suspend their expectations of reality so that we can enter into a other world. And that is a language ploy. It's a kind of a mental cue to switch off your sense of reality. And so when I see that kind of manipulation of language, it really goes back to something really fundamental to how we situate our mind when we hear certain key phrases. Thanks.
Yeah. Pat, are you trying to jump in or no? I think it reminds me of Arendt's first preface to the Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talks about the need to turn against both radical hope and radical despair so that we can come face to face with what is happening. And I think that also comes out in this chapter in the Eichmann book on the final solution, where, she's in taking up this kind of defense case of Eichmann, she's doing a couple of things, right? She's trying to, emphasize the point that this trial isn't really about Eichmann. Eichmann is standing in some ways, that the crimes that are on trial are so horrific that the legal system is not equipped to confront them, right? And that, Eichmann in this way, you can't stand in for the totality of all Nazi crimes. And she's also thinking about this question of bureaucratization and language and thinking and trying to understand how somebody like Eichmann could be so blind in some ways to what it was that he was seeing. I think there's this really powerful sentence in that chapter where after she gives these, 3 examples of the things, 4 examples of things he did see, right, that Roger was talking about. And then she just has this short sentence where she says, he didn't see much, right? In reality, he didn't see much. He actually, and then she's talking about his memory, because Eichmann, he doesn't actually have the timeline. He wasn't really there. He was never on the front line. And so she's thinking about what it is that he does see. And she's thinking about how it is that he was able to turn off those, human qualities that would have allowed him to see the horror, the real horror and monstrosity of what it was that he was looking at. When I read those stories, I don't find his physical repulsion to be an admission of guilt. Personally, I don't read it that way. I read it as her kind of emphasizing his lack of thinking, his lack of human ability, that it's about his immediate physical and affective response to what is happening. It's not about his complicity or horror, or, she's using those examples to illustrate the ways in which he doesn't see how his own role in the Nazi regime creates those situations. All he can see is his own immediate physical response and his own disgust. It's about him. He doesn't have that reflective consciousness there to experience real guilt in that way. And so it's this, I think, once upon a time, in that sense, is one of those linguistic mechanisms we use to imagine something other than what it is. And I think for Arendt, she's always turning against that, but her question is bringing us back to how can we see what is in front of us. You look like you wanted yeah.
I love these points. I think language is important, critically important. I guess what I'm wondering about is how much are we taking into account this as a racist totalitarian state? Hitler is the law. Jews are stateless people. They're not citizens. There is no legal protection for them anywhere. What Hitler says is the law. In effect, people have pledged unconditional allegiance to Hitler. Most of these people have grown up in a Nazi world. They've had this brief interlude with democracy, but it's not a lean for them. They lean towards the autocratic governments that they had prior to the Nazis.
Yeah.
And again, nothing the Nazis, or at least the SS, do is illegal other than stealing in the midst of an annihilation process. So this is a new normal, a bizarre normal, and we seem to be applying all the things that we think the average person would do in the normals that we experience in this world, in this democratic universe, whatever we think of Trump right now. It still has opposing parties. It still has alternative voices and alternative ideas. And I'm just wondering if most people, in my opinion, would do, if they were in Eichmann's position, the same thing as he did, conscience or no conscience, thinking or not thinking. I'm not sure what any of that means, because I think you turn off these things for self-efficacy. And to give them the death penalty means we would give any average person in such a situation the death penalty, because the forces are so set against them, I can't imagine them behaving otherwise.
Yeah.
This is Scott McLean again. Peter has a good. That was a really good point. Here's something that I think, based on what you said, was you're absolutely right in terms of what you said about the Germans. But what I think could happen is we won't, like, for example, I can't imagine, and I could be wrong, but I can't imagine our society in America going to a Holocaust. But I could see us doing something today that generations, 3 or 4 generations from now, look back on something we do today, and we don't even, like right now, we don't even think of it as being potentially wrong, but somebody's going to have a reading group 75 years from now and saying, oh, back in 2020, can you believe that our great-grandparents did this? And we don't even know what it is right now. Because you know what? If the Nazis would have won the war, they would have said they would have been, in quotes, right, because they won the war. So, I'm just wondering, can we identify things now that will 75 years from now, I don't know what it is. 75 years from now, will they think it's horrible that kids today watch cat videos for humor because it, degrades animals? I don't know. But I think, maybe I'm going off on a tangent. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Can I jump in, please, Sam? It's Margaret again.
Hi, Margaret. Go for it.
I really don't think that Arendt is propounding a theory of moral relativism. And I'm hearing what's starting to sound like good people on both sides. And it's pretty upsetting, I have to say, because I don't think that Arendt is being an apologist for Eichmann. I think that she's trying to show how terrifying it is that someone can wander into these kinds of actions without looking around them, without looking down the road, without having a sense of consequence. There is no way that you take an infant from a parent's arms and you think, oh, golly, I wonder if in 3 or 4 generations someone will think this is bad. It's what I was told to do today, so it's not really a big deal. I don't think, but hey, everybody would do that. So I take exception to those points pretty strongly, as you might hear. And I really don't think that that's where Arendt is going with this. If I'm wrong, Sam, please tell me.
This is Scott again. That's not, I guess, I agree with you 100%. I guess what I'm saying is although nothing to the scale of the Holocaust has ever occurred before, certainly babies and kids and stuff were killed at a much higher rate, in the past than now. So it wasn't as uncommon, it's absolutely evil. But what I'm saying is, it wasn't as uncommon, in the history for these type of atrocities on a smaller level, to happen. I just, and this is on a much smaller scale, I admit, but I just read that, that during Shakespeare, when he had the plays in the Globe Theater, during breaks, this is a largely Christian, believing in Jesus and God group, watching these plays, in the 1500s, and that in the acts between the plays, they used to light live cats on fire and burn them and let them jump around, and everybody would laugh and cheer and all of this kind of stuff. Now, this is on a much smaller scale, but what I'm saying is that, those people were Christian people, and what they did there, I consider very abhorrent. But to them, it was like not abhorrent at all.
I think there's, Arendt talks about this in a few places. This isn't a question of scale. And it's not, I don't, unless I'm mishearing something, I don't really think it's a point of comparison. And I don't really think that we can compare this to anything else. And Arendt warns against analogies and such comparisons historically, because she says they lead to, simple truths or a kind of sense that it is possible to comprehend what is happening. One of the points that she makes, and I think is one of the frustrations with the, the way that she wrote the Eichmann book, with the tone, but one of the points that she makes in Origins and other places is that the Holocaust, the emergence of totalitarianism as an entirely new form of political rule and organization in the 20th century is in a certain way incomprehensible, right? We can't make logical sense out of something that is so inhuman, so horrific, that it, is like any other kind of crime. And this is her sarcastic, sardonic defense of Eichmann here, and emphasizing her point that, he's really being held up as the stand-in for all of Nazi crimes, right? Is that what he did is utterly, indefensible. But if we pull back and look at the facts show us, that he really wasn't Goebbels, he wasn't Himmler, he wasn't Hitler, but he thought a lot of himself, and he was very proud of everything he had done, and he was very blind, narcissistically so almost, it seems like the way she describes it, to the actual horrors that he contributed to through his position, right? And this is, it's unthinking, it's incomprehensible in that way. We have this human tendency, I think, to always want to make sense out of something, especially when that something is something that we find morally incomprehensible. But part of Arendt's argument here is that, we have to find a way to understand. And that understanding requires us, to imagine. And what this means here, is that Eichmann lacked that fundamental capacity to imagine harm. So I don't want to Peter, it looks like you want to jump in, but you're muted. So if you want to add something, you can. I'm not sure if you're on the phone, though. You're on my screen talking, but I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm just trying to avoid the feedback. Okay. Did you finish what you wanted to say, though? I can wait.
I rather let you guys talk. So I mean, I think I made my point. I can keep going.
I mean, the only fear I have is that we make ourselves feel good by finding Eichmann guilty, killing him. I'm not in any way suggesting a moral relativism in Hannah Arendt or myself or anybody here. I'm questioning whether we're being honest about our actions that we would take in the situations that the folks in Nazi Germany found themselves. I'm not claiming that they were innocent of those situations. They failed to fight it. But that being said, once that democracy is destroyed and Hitler is the all-consuming power, with the power of the state behind him, and the state is all-powerful in such a situation, I don't think we can appreciate how much all of us would do these things. Just in a country that had, which is the country we live in, a democracy. We took citizens of Japanese descent and interned them, put them in jails, in effect, horrific type jails out in the middle of nowhere, and found that to be legal. So our citizenship doesn't even protect us. And prior to that, again, in the 20th century, we had lynchings that were not only conducted with full approval of the surrounding authorities, but the pictures of those lynchings were sent around the country through the U.S. mail like you were somewhere at Disneyland and saying, look, Ma, look where I am right now. And you were committing a horrific act against a fellow human being. That was normal. That was normal in a country with a democracy. So I think we're fooling ourselves into thinking we would behave differently in such a society, and that by calling him guilty, we're going to somehow help ourselves.
No, it's not just calling him guilty. I think there's two things here. So one is, Arendt makes it very clear that her argument about the banality of evil by no means that each and every one of us is capable of acting like Eichmann did. Not all of us are capable, right? She's not making that argument because he acted this way because evil is banal and something that is done by human beings and not by monsters. It doesn't mean that everybody is capable of doing it. I think that she's, this question that you're raising, I think is part of the question that we should be wrestling with, which is the second thing, which is this tension that exists between our moral conscience, and we talked about thinking in the VRG a lot for those of you who are on, between moral conscience and our consciousness, right? So, the example that you gave of the Japanese internment camp is an example Arendt takes up, and she was horrified by this, and it's one of her arguments and critiques of the nation state. Nation state actually fails to protect the rights of citizens historically, which is one of the things that a nation state is supposed to do. But that we have to find a way in thinking to open up the space where we can see where our values, what we deem to be good and bad and right and wrong, are being shaped by the law, right? Are being shaped by the normal social and political orders that are commonplace, right? And sometimes it's necessary to break the law. She says, for herself, she says, I had to become an outlaw. That was the only way to go on. I had to break the law because the law was all those things that you were just describing, Peter, right? It was, killing became legal, right? And so, and then she gives other examples of this, right? So she gives Socrates as a famous example. Thoreau, who spent a night in jail instead of paying his poll tax to protest the war. MLK is a good example of this as well. But so how do we have this, how do we have this conversation that I think you're raising with ourselves about moral complicity, right? How do we find that courage? She calls it courage, right? How do we find that courage to break the law when the law is unjust? I mean, so Roger brought up the example of the camps at the borders, for immigrants. So there's a question of complicity there. Absolutely, there's a question of moral complicity, right? This is, I think for probably most of us, this is horrifying. This is a really, this is an immoral thing that is happening in our country. It's legal. And some people are going to protest. Some people are getting arrested, right? Some, doctors are going and routinely getting arrested, trying to give flu shots and provide care. They're breaking the law, and they're acting in a way that's in accord with their moral consciousness and not in accord with the conscience of society at this moment. I think, this is such an, this is really part of her argument, and trying to, that's why she's taking on this question of thinking. It gets criticized though, why would you try to understand, the way Eichmann was thinking? He would, to just dismiss him and to just, say, of course he's a Nazi, of course he's anti-Semitic. I mean, yeah, all of these things are true, and he has to die and all of this, but there's more to it, right? It's a more complex political question that we have to wrestle with.
As I get Peter's point, oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure who's Pat. You want to jump on?
I just want to say, as I got Peter's point, is who gets to throw the first stone, and trying to bring this conversation about Eichmann and morality, and we try to bring it up to today. What's going on today as we move toward an authoritarian government society, and millions of people supporting him, supporting the Trump. They're not his enablers, the guys at the top, but they're the guys down in the cog area where Eichmann. I know he's more than a cog, but less than an enabler. And how do we deal in a rational way with a substantial part of our fellow citizens who simply seem to be walking into what we understand, what some of us, at least many of us, think is an authoritarian state, which is what we had in Germany.
So, Sam, I'd like to say something about what you just said, which is we here in my city here just had a celebration of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And in the conversations about the Underground Railroad, it became very clear that the people who ran the railroad were running a criminal enterprise from the point of view of the society at the time. So to Peter's point, and to something that you just said, and in fact, what Pat is actually pointing to, the question is, if we understand that there are things going on today which are trending toward an authoritarian system in this country, and if the behavior that we point to is so clearly immoral, what am I doing? What am I doing? If I think I might have resisted the Nazis, if I think I might have worked with the underground to get the free slaves, maybe I would have in that time because it's once upon a time. But what am I doing today? That's the true question we need to ask ourselves, and the question that this book puts in our face.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more.
I agree. Yeah. Peter, you
Thank
want
you.
to respond?
One quick thing, the doctors who are working on the borders and might get arrested, they will be protected by lawyers that we've set up institutionally to look to see if their rights are being violated. There are still rights here that this country acknowledges. Whether they always work out the way we want them to, fine, that might not be the case. But just to the last point, if it gets past democracy, some of those institutions, the Underground Railroad, there were places you could go to. There were places where there were sympathetic ears and actors. There's no place in Nazi Germany where anybody could go to. The Evian Conference closed all the doors. They said, we'll do something, and none of them did anything but Trujillo, and that was to lighten the race. So if you have no place to go, the door is closed, and people will behave the way the Eichmanns do. We should be protecting this democracy with every ounce of our strength. It's the only thing that protects us, to allow us to be the good we want to be, and also at the same time the rational people we are, which is we don't commit suicide that easily.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes humanity enters into the picture. When my family was still living in Germany before we came here, a neighbor and a close friend was planning to leave. They were to leave, let us say, today is Friday, they were planning to leave on Monday. And it was really known in the neighborhood that they were getting ready to leave. And on Friday, the local Gauleiter, the representative of the Nazi party in the neighborhood, came to their door and said, leave now because the Gestapo is coming tomorrow morning. And so this guy was a Nazi, and he warned them, and they ended up, they spent 3 days in taxis in Berlin, just going from taxi to taxi until their boat was ready to go. So there's always some amount of humanity that enters into the picture, and it's different, and it's I think not appropriate to paint everybody with the same brush. But I return to my original comment, which is not what are they doing, but what am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just to draw it back, one of the ways that we do that is by paying attention to the language that we use in conversation to talk about these kinds of political questions. I think that's one of Arendt's points that she comes back to, and she says, in more than one place, you can judge how a person is thinking by the language they choose to use. And I think that's actually one of the scary things about our political moment right now is what we're watching happen to language, and the loss, not just the loss of civility in political conversation and the way that we're talking to each other, but the way that we're using the language itself doesn't feel like it is necessarily reflective of the world as we need to confront it, to ask that question, Jack, and what we can be doing. We're about out of time. Are there any last thoughts or questions in the chat box? I think I've been going through, and I think a lot of people who wrote in here jumped in. B, did you wanna? I see that you tried to jump in on. I don't mean to put you on the spot, or if there's anybody who wants to jump in, or otherwise, this is a nice place to maybe wrap things up.
I had a quick story I thought I might share with everyone just as a food for thought. A conversation
Okay.
I had last Sunday with a British expat who was in Turkey in 2016 when the last coup happened there. And I was asking her, why did she move to Cyprus? And she said, oh, it became impossible to live in Turkey anymore. She'd been there for 8 years and learned the language. And
Yeah.
she got sued by a random person for $100,000 for a car she never rented, and was 7 days from summarial judgment. And she said, this is what happens when there's this cult of personality, that people begin to see that the systems are infected from top to bottom, and that you can get away with abusing the legal system, which is what she was facing. And she had to flee the country. And this is a story that happened in the last 3 years. And this happened to someone I actually met. And this is what's happening now. This is not an ancient concept. This is not an old thing. This can happen at the drop of a hat, and is something we should be taking very seriously. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. All right, so thank you, everybody. This was a good conversation. I think we're really wrestling with the key questions that this book brings up, and they're not easy questions. And I don't think that they're easy conversations. So I really appreciate everybody's contributions and willingness to talk and share and give their opinions and to talk with each other. So we will see you in 2 weeks for the next virtual reading group. In the meantime, enjoy reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, and Roger and I look forward to talking with you.
Isn't it 1 week?
Oh, is it 1 week? I thought I was going off of, I will talk 1 second. Let me pull it up. I closed down everything else in the hopes that my computer would behave better, but alas, I'm talking into my phone.
Yeah, the 28th. The 28th.
It's the 28th. So
next week.
we will.
Next week.
Yes. So
Because
we will.
I'm looking.
Yes. So on February 28th, we will be reading the Wannsee Conference for Pontius Pilate, Duties of a Law-Abiding Citizen, Deportation from the Reich, Germany, Austria, and the Protectorate. So another set of 3 chapters that all go together. And so we will see you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Samantha.
Thank you.
Bye, Sam. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Yeah, bye.